I'm Matthew Wilkinson from Safaritalk.net. Last year, 668 rhinos in South Africa alone were brutally poached for their horns. This represents almost 2 rhinos killed per day to satisfy demand from China, Vietnam, and other Oriental countries. In this 3-part Safari Talk interview with the renowned Dr. Ian Player and long-term friend and fellow conservationist Paul Dutton, we discuss a range of issues, starting with the history of Operation Rhino and Dr. Player's own involvement in the development of the M99 tranquilizing drug.
What got Operation Rhino going was the fact that in 1953 I did the very first aerial count in Umfolozi Game Reserve with Ranger Hendrik van Schoor, and we counted 437 rhino. By 1960 that had risen to something like 600 rhino, and at the same time there was a lot of displacement of people from the Msingo, the Tugeli Ferry area, and they were coming back into the old tribal lands and threatening the park. And some of them were bringing their cattle, and it was possible that there would be an outbreak of anthrax, and that would have been the end of the white rhino, because here they were concentrated. So it was a tremendous responsibility. So I went to the board and said that I really thought the time had come to start to capture and translocate and put them back in their former habitat. Well, the board wasn't very keen, because they said that the whole Umfolozi Game Reserve really depended upon the white rhino. If we took him away, the government of the day could quite easily deep reclaim Umfolozi and say it's not needed, and they would have dished it out to to cattle ranchers and local tribespeople. Anyway, it was a matter of persistence, and eventually, thanks largely to the support of Colonel Vincent, that they agreed that we could initiate what became Operation Rhino. But then one had to find the ways of the capture, and that's where Dr. Anthony Harthorn, a British veterinarian, invited me to Uganda, where they were catching the last of the northern white rhino, so that I could learn from the professional game trappers how they were loading and making bomas and crates. And in the meantime, Harthorn was experimenting with drugs. And then he came down in the latter part of 1960 and experimented with a number of drugs. One of them was galamine triethylide, which was quite fatal. You had to be on the rhino within a few moments to give it the antidote. But then eventually he came up with morphine.
Okay.
And it was quite interesting for me, because when I had been thinking of the capture, I'd gone to our local doctor and I'd asked him, having remembered having had morphine before operations, and I asked him, how much morphine would you need to bring down a 2,000-pound rhino? And he looked at me and he said, a bloody bucketful, man, a bloody bucketful. Anyway, interestingly enough, it was eventually morphine, which started off with a 20cc dart, and which was quite a complicated little instrument in order to get the drug in. And then eventually, thanks to Harthorn's hard work, it was synthesized into what became known as M99. So from a 20cc dart, we went to a 1 or 2cc dart. And that made all the difference, because with the 20cc dart, the wounds were getting very badly infected. And I can remember those of us who were working in the bomas, sometimes you could almost put your full arm in to scrape the pus out. The wounds were so bad. And the strategy was quite clear in my mind right from the very beginning, and that was to, first of all, re-establish the white rhino at all the parks in KwaZulu-Natal where they had once existed, Mkuzi and Ndumo and Itala in the north, and then to send them to other parts like the Kruger National Park, where they had become extinct in 1896, the last one being shot in the Matamiri bush, and then from there to send them to Botswana and to what was then Rhodesia, and then at the same time to order to make sure that because South Africa was very volatile at that time, could quite easily have exploded, and we'd already seen what had happened in the rest of Africa with the collapse of the colonial regimes. The first to suffer was always the wildlife, and that film Adio Africa really told that story very graphically. So I said we must get them out of the country as well. And Paul here and his wife Anne took some of the rhino away. And then in 1970, the rhino population in Umfolozi had risen so dramatically that the board were considering culling the rhino in Umfolozi. And I remember saying to one of my senior colleagues, that'll be over my dead body. Because I knew, having been to America in 1964 and travelled as a result of being invited there by Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer all over the United States, that these safari parks were developing. And so I knew that there was a lot of places where we could send the rhino to. But in order to make sure that they would be safe, we needed to send 20 at a time. Eventually the board agreed to let me go, although I must say there were quite a few of my colleagues who had their prayer mats out hoping that I would fail. I started off in the United Kingdom because I knew that if I could persuade the London Zoological Society to take 20 rhino for Whipsnade, their safari park outside of London, that that would have a domino effect and the Americans would be quick to follow suit. Well, it was easier said than done. I sat in London for a month talking to people in the Zoological Society, and they were prevaricating, and eventually I remembered that I'd taken Edmund de Rothschild, the great banker, out on a wilderness trail in Umfolozi. So I went to see him and told him the story, and he said, "What's the hold-up?" I said, "Well, I can't get to the chairman, who was Solly Zuckerman." So he said, "Why?" I said, "Well, they won't let me see him." So he just picked up the phone and said to his secretary, "Get me Solly." And Solly came on the line, and Eddie de Rothschild spoke to him, and he put his hand over the phone. He said, "He can't see you today. Will tomorrow do?" I said, "I'll be there." So I went down the next day to Whitehall. He was then the scientific advisor to the British Cabinet. It took me 10 minutes to persuade him to buy 20. And as I was walking out, he said, "Who's going to pay for them?" So I said, "You better ask Eddie de Rothschild," which eventually they did. But that was the beginning. And then from there I went across to America, to San Diego, where I had some very good friends made during the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer tour. And it took me a lunch, or a dinner actually. It took me a dinner to convince the director, Charlie Schroeder, and the chairman of the board to take 20 rhino, because they had started what became known as the Wild Animal Park, Escondido, about 30 miles out of San Diego. In one way, it was one of the amusing experiences of my life, because when they agreed to take 20, having heard that London Zoological Society were taking 20, we shook hands, and that was the deal. But when I got back, the accountant was very angry because I didn't come back with a contract. And I said, "Don't you understand? I mean, this is San Diego Zoological Society," and we shook hands, and that was the deal. "No, you can't do that. You've got to have a contract." And So it went on and on and on. And eventually I told my friends in San Diego what had happened, and they found it very funny. And if you go to the Wild Animal Park today, to enter it, you go through a big aviary. And when you get out the other side, there is a full-grown bronze rhino statue. And on it, there's a little plaque says, "A deal done on a handshake." Anyway, from San Diego, my wife and I then took a car and we went down to Orange County, where there was a South African who was running a safari park. And I told him the whole story, and he said, "Well, if I buy 50, will you do a deal?" So I said, "You got a deal." So they bought 50, and from there I went to Texas. Anyway, the long and short of it, after 6 weeks, something like 200 rhino had been sold overseas, and I felt very happy that at least we got a good population out. In the meantime, at home, the operation was continuing. John Clark and Nick Steele and Kenra Shah and our great friend here, Paul, were making sure that the operation was getting rhino to the other parts of southern Africa. We sent them to what was then Rhodesia, and we found that we could drive for 24 hours. You could dart them, load them into a crate, and then go for 24 hours. And that took us 24 hours to get from Mumfolozi to Wankie Park. So they went to Wankie, to Kyle, to McIlvain, and we had a good population there. And then the next thing was into Botswana. So we repopulated the whole of southern Africa. But one of the interesting statistics is that in 1960, when we began Operation Rhino, there were on the continent of Africa something like 60,000 black rhino. And in Umfolozi, 437 white rhino, and in Shishui, about 400 black rhino. Whew. By the end of Operation Rhino, the black rhino in Africa had been reduced to a few thousand, whereas the white rhino were expanding all the time. And what also led to that, which a lot of people don't understand, and some don't want to understand, is that in 1970, thanks to the hard work of David Cook, they were put back onto the hunting list. And that meant that game ranchers, and game ranching was at that time beginning to expand, were able to buy rhino, put them on the ranch, and then have American and British and German and Italian and Portuguese hunters come and shoot them. And they were paying a lot of money. And then, to the great credit of the ranchers, they were taking that money, buying more land, and consequently buying more rhino. So the number of rhinos shot were minimal. But what it meant was that the habitat was being expanded all the time, and they were buying more and more rhino. And that literally led to an explosion of white rhino. So we thought, well, we've done our stuff now. And of course, I was enormously grateful to those who worked with me. I mean, because I can honestly say it wasn't a question of getting people to work; it was a question of stopping them from working, because they would go on for 24 hours. I mean, men like Amakubu Ntombela, who was the tracker, because in the first, it wasn't that easy, because sometimes he would dart a rhino and be followed by the horsemen, and then it would get lost. But the Amakubu would then meticulously pick up the tracks, and he would track that rhino until we found it.